Welcome to Saga Hunter's YouTube channel. In this video I want to talk about the difference between dye and pigment. It is something we often talk about, but some people probably don't know the details about it and what is really the difference. And I really hear some people mix the two expressions interchangeably, and it's not the same. I want to give a nerd alert here because I have to go into some chemistry here. I'll try and keep it as not detailed as possible, and yeah, be warned, it is nerdy. Now, pigment. I'll put dye over here. Pigment is tiny grains. It is like your flour in your kitchen. It is something that has been milled down to a fine powder. In this instance, it is not grain. This time it's actually usually rocks or synthetically made rocks that has been ground down to a fine powder, and then it get mixed with, if watercolor, it get mixed with sugars and things like that to help it lift up into the water. It just kind of floats in whatever media you have. If you take a colored pencil, then it's basically wax matrix with all these little specks of grain floating around into it. How much pigment they put in there versus other things, wax or oil or just fillers, depends on the brands. The cheaper brands will have less pigment and more filler, and the expensive brands will have mostly pigment and not very much filler. The grains do not dissolve in water. They do not dissolve. They always remain like this. If you have a watercolor pencil or even a wax pencil, when you use some kind of solvents, that being water or turpentine or things like that, if you dissolve pencils with any kind of solvent, you dissolve the carrying agent, not the pigments. The pigments are released from the carrying agent, and then you can spread them around on the paper with your brush. So they when you see somebody use, for instance, a colored pencil and they put odorless spirit of cestid or whatever on it, they dissolve the wax and the oils in the pencil, not the pigments. Dyes, on the other hand, these are free molecules. And they are dissolved in whatever media they are. Dye we will often find in markers, either watercolor markers or alcohol markers. And it's the same thing. There is no pigment in here. These are free molecules that floats around between the molecules of water or the molecules of alcohol. So that's a huge difference. So when you lay down a pigment-based color on whatever surface, and it will always be rough, you got all these little grains sitting on the surface of your canvas or your paper or your wood or whatever you put them onto. Each grain contains of a lot of molecules. And this has to, we get back to that. But that each grain has lots of molecules, and each layer has lots of pigment grains. You will usually use dye on either fabric or paper, rarely on other subjects. They put just a molecule or two or three, just a few layers of molecules on the paper, and depending on how the paper is made, it can also sink in and be in between the fibers. You can have molecules spread around in the fibers inside the paper itself. And that makes a huge difference on how they act. Now, you can have paper that has some kind of surface treatment. It can either be slightly waxed, or it can have gelatin on the top, preventing this from happening, prevent the pigments to get into the paper. So you get only the molecule sitting on top of the paper. But it is still very thin layers of color you get. Pigments tend to be inorganic. And this pretty much equals that they are not very reactable. Whereas most dyes are organic and they are highly reactable. Now, what does this mean? This means inorganic materials are everything that is made of other things than pure carbon. As soon as we start having carbon and hydrogen together, we go over in the organic side. You can also compare something inorganic. You all know is rocks, pebbles, mountains. They are, for the most part, made of inorganic minerals. While organic, you know it in your vegetables and your steak and your food and yourself. Everything living is made predominantly of organic materials. There are some crossovers and stuff where our bones and teeth are made of inorganic stuff, and yeah. But in overall, organic materials deteriorate fast because they react to things like UV light and oxygen. Inorganic tends to not do it as much or not as fast. So pigments last longer. It takes a lot of time to break this down, even if you add water and oxygen and UV light. Some inorganics break down faster than others, and the same is true for organics. There are some exceptions to both groups, but in general, pigments are light fast. And that goes down to them not being very reactable. When you add UV lighting to any kind of chemical compound, it will, over time, change its chemical composition. The difference is how fast it happens. Some pigments can last for centuries. There's not a lot of dyes that will do the same thing. Dyes usually pale down in the matter of a few years at the best, whereas most pigments last at least 2 or 3 years before they start to fade. And part of their the pigment's got two things going for them, and one comes back to that there's way more molecules here to break down and ruin before you get down and you get the shine of the paper or whatever it's painted onto starts to shine through, or change color to something else. Then over here they react faster and they got a thinner layer. So that is why dye is considered not light fast, while pigment often are. So I'd say the least the least light fast pigments are still better than the best of the dyes. So if you are not a professional artist who sells art for a living, neither of these things really matters. Yeah, it depends. If you make art to hang on the wall, you might consider using a pigment instead of a dye, or you, well, just have to live with it that dye picture doesn't last very long compared to if you had done it even in pigments. But the biggest difference is how it reacts on paper. If you're using things like watercolor, or yeah, even if you use alcohol markers, you really have to look into what kind of paper you use. At least if you want to be able to move the colors around a little bit. If you want to make gradients or highlights or things, if you have watercolor, this is a watercolor brush, and that is actually just printer paper I picked out of my printer. And where's my brush? It is there. If there's no sizing to it, see that this is a watercolor marker and I can't move it on this paper. I have to, even if I dissolve the paper, it won't move because this is printer paper. It has no sizing to it. Now this is watercolor paper I got underneath. If we put it on there and add water, you can thin it out and move it, because this has a surface protected, so that things can't soak into it as easy. Pigments are a little more forgiving about what paper you put them on. I got a watercolor pencil here. It won't be good on this paper, but at least I can pick it up, because the pigments does not react with the paper. It sits on top of it, no matter how I do it. And it will of course also work great on watercolor paper. So that was my nerdy rant about pigments and dyes. I hope somebody will enjoy this. Yeah, thank you for watching.